opened this morning with the devotions of Jesus, the divinity of Jesus, and dinner with Jesus. And this evening we're going to look at three more points of things that Jesus did, very familiar to most of us. The disciples of Jesus, where he appointed them, demons and Jesus, and death and Jesus. Mark addresses all of these issues as well. So we'll begin with the disciples of Jesus in Mark chapter 3. There are two or three other lists of the disciples. One is in Acts, one is in Matthew, and I think one is in Luke. And in every list, Simon Peter is at the top. Now, of course, he was the one who had the first sermon on the day of Pentecost, and he was the natural leader of the group. We'll be using Mark chapter 3, starting with verse number 13. Mark 3, verse number 13. Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. Now, I talked to you this morning about in his devotions how he prepared himself for various ministries he had to perform. Other gospel writers tell us that he prayed for all of these disciples as well before he appointed them. Mark simply says that he appointed them. So in verse 14, he appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter. James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. To them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Remember, they were very impetuous, and they one time asked him when the Samaritans refused to let Jesus go through their village. They said, "Do you want us to let fire come down and destroy them like Elijah did?" And from then on, they were known as sons of thunder. And Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now, this group of disciples were quite a menagerie. At least 4 of them were fishermen. Peter, Andrew, James, and John were all fishermen, and were in business together. And they probably were fairly wealthy because of the type of business that they were in as fishermen. And we know that Andrew and Philip were brothers, and we know that Thomas was the doubter. We know about Simon the Zealot. Simon Zelotes, as it says in the King James, was what I would call almost even though he wasn't convicted of any crimes, it would almost be like a terrorist. That was the way he felt about the Roman government. The Roman government was ruling the Jewish people, and he hated the Roman government along with the other Jewish people. That's one reason they wanted a Messiah that was going to come and deliver them from Rome. So he undermined the government any chance he could get. And I got to thinking, I wonder what kind of relationship he had when Matthew became a disciple. Because Matthew, also known as Levi, was a Jew who was a Roman tax collector, a publican, and they, as you already know, were very much despised. So I could see these two clashing. And these disciples did clash a lot. We don't always have a record of their clashes. We do have a record of some of them clashing. And when the mother of James and John asked Jesus for prominent places beside him in the kingdom, the others got jealous. And he had to kind of straighten that situation out the best way that he could, and, in various ways, because this conflict was going on. We don't normally think about this happening among the disciples. But it's interesting because these disciples came from such different backgrounds, and yet he was able to bring them together. After his death, when the church started, they were one group, and you no longer hear any conflicts between them after the church got started. They worked hard together to get the message of Christ out to the people. Now we want to look at demons and Jesus in Matthew chapter 5. Demons were on the earth at this time, and we know that Jesus healed a lot of people of demonology. And we wonder sometimes why that isn't in existence as much today as it was then. One of the reasons, I think, is because of Jesus' personal ministry. That Satan used every power of his being to destroy and discredit the Lord. And I kind of think that's one reason there were so many demon activities in the world at that time. They're real, and the New Testament talks about them being real in the book of Ephesians chapter 6. And we are told through the Scriptures not to tap into the spirit world where the demons reside, and to have them come in contact with us. We know people that are doing that. For the most part, God keeps them away from us. But we know that they really took possession of many people, and two of the people that now here you're going to read about one demon-possessed man, but Matthew talks about two of them. But this one was probably the most dominant one, and the one that was doing the speaking to Jesus about these demons, how many there were, and that he wanted them to be cast into the swine and all of that. So if you go to another gospel, you'll see that, and you may think that there's a contradiction. There were actually two demon-possessed men, but this section of Scripture focuses on one of them that was healed. And so Jesus had power over the demons. We already noticed in the list of the disciples that he also gave them power over the demons as well. We have an incident when Jesus went to the Mount of Transfiguration with Peter, James, and John, that down in the valley, after they came down from the mountain, Jesus found religious leaders arguing with the disciples because a man came to the disciples whose son had a demon, and they couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't fix it. And Jesus, of course, did. And then they wondered why they couldn't do it. And he said, this comes by prayer and fasting. So evidently the disciples were neglecting their personal prayer life and their prayer and their fasting experience as well. So this is what Christian leaders need to watch out for. We know of many Christian leaders. You probably know some personally, whether on a international level or local level, in the Church of Christ or any other church that had problems, moral problems, and had to leave their churches and their ministries. And some of them were very, very good preachers and just wonderful people. I've known several personally in my life in the churches of Christ that they had that experience. And it's sad because I think what can happen easily is that we as ministers and elders and deacons as well can be helping other people and preparing lessons and things like that, but not really preparing our own hearts with the Word of God and meditating and praying like we should. But this is an example of Jesus healing demonology. So this starts in chapter 5 with verse number 1. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. That's where these fellows were living, in the cemetery. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. He is very violent, and people were afraid of him, and they even chained him up, but he was so powerfully strong that he broke the chains. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. They even put irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. You can imagine what a weird feeling that would be, to go out in the night and hear this demon-possessed man screaming. How unnerving that would be. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. Now remember, his mind probably came and went. I think part of this was himself, and part of it was the demons speaking. But, of course, demons, we know, acknowledge Jesus, and we'll see that here. They even confess Jesus. They believe in Jesus. So that kind of tells us that faith alone is not enough to please the Lord, but it's faith and obedience. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Now, undoubtedly, this was the demon speaking. "In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." In a Roman legion, there could be as many as 6,000 soldiers. And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Now we want to notice what a wonderful miracle was performed. We want to notice how people reacted to it. You would think everybody would say, "Oh, how wonderful." With no more screaming in the middle of the night. No more worrying about him coming naked down into the village and having to put chains on him and get him out of our sight. But that wasn't their reaction at all, as we'll notice here in a minute. Now, one man did have a very positive reaction, and that's the one who was healed. There's a moral question here as well. There are those who would say that Jesus, by sending the impure spirits into the pigs, was destroying personal property and the livelihood of those who owned the pigs. So we'll read about it here. Those tending the pigs ran off, reported this in the town and countryside, and the people went out to see what happened. When they came to Jesus, now notice, they saw the result of this miracle. They saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed. no longer naked, and in his right mind, and they were afraid. I can understand them being afraid maybe at what happened. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs as well. Now notice what the people did. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave. Leave our region. Boy, I'd like to have somebody like that hanging around in my neighborhood. But notice the attitude of the one who was healed. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed, he also begged. They pleaded with Jesus to leave, but he said he was begging him to go with Jesus. Jesus did not let him. And the reason Jesus didn't let him is because Jesus was giving him a ministry that would be much more effective than him going with Christ. Go home, he said, to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And all the people were amazed. Look at how much of an influence he would have been by giving his testimony to all of those people who knew what had happened to him, who knew how ravagely insane he was, and now he is so changed. So that is a wonderful, wonderful story. Now, when it comes to the criticism of Jesus for putting the demons in the pigs and destroying personal property, we have this question: is not a man more important than animals? You know, we have people today that don't think so. We have people today who think animals are more important than people. We have people who are abortionists, but they don't want the eggs of a certain bird to be destroyed. They love animals more than people. Also, if this person was a Jew, and he probably wasn't, but if he was a Jew that owned the herd, he wasn't supposed to have them in the first place, because pigs were unclean for Jewish people. You weren't supposed to eat them, you weren't supposed to raise them, you weren't supposed to have them. And probably most important of all is, if you're God, you can do what you want to do. And he did. And he demonstrated his power through this wonderful miracle. But then we close with the death and Jesus. We know that Jesus raised, in the Gospels, raised 3 people that are recorded. And this is one of them. This is the little 12-year-old girl that was the daughter of Jairus, who is a ruler of the synagogue. And the other one is a man who was a young man who is already had died. He was in the funeral procession, gone to the graveyard, and Jesus went up and touched the funeral pyre, and he just raised up. And of course, the third one was his real good friend Lazarus, whom he raised from the dead. But this is the daughter of Jairus, and we're going to notice from verses 35 to 43 here. It's a lengthy section of Scripture, because what happened is that Jairus comes to Jesus and to tell him that his little daughter is sick. And so Jesus said, well, I'll come to your house. So they were on their way to the house. And while they were on the way to the house, this woman, the child was 12 years old. This woman had been sick for 12 years of a blood disease, and she went to all kinds of doctors, spent all her money, and couldn't get any better. So she kind of sneaked up on Jesus, touched his garment. He noticed power leaving him, but she was healed. So he took time with her. Now I can imagine the frustration that Jairus may have had, that Jesus said he was going to go to his house, but here he stopped to help this woman, talk to this woman, and heal this woman. And even more frustrating for Jairus was that while this was going on with the woman, one of Jairus' friends came up and said, well, don't bother the master any longer. Your daughter is dead. But of course, Jesus gave him hope, and he said, I'm still going to your house. And so it's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful story. Let's start with verse number 35. That leads you up to it. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother the teacher anymore? Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, don't be afraid, just believe. Now, in the Greek language, it would have the idea of keep on believing, which means that Jairus came to him in faith. Even though he was a Jewish religious leader, among all other Jewish leaders who were opposed to Jesus, he was in bad straits. There was nobody else that could do anything for his daughter unless it be Jesus. So Jesus was as much saying, keep on believing. In verse 37, he did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John. These were called the inner circle of the disciples. And most scholars believe, and I do too, and I think you recognize it too by reading the scriptures as often as you had over the years, these are the disciples that needed him the most. Peter was impetuous. James and John were hotheads. And as Peter, as well-meaning as he was, on wanting to do all he could for Jesus, he was always fumbling around and doing something wrong when he shouldn't. And so Jesus wanted to have them with him when a lot of these things took place. So the three disciples were there, the immediate family was there, but Jesus didn't let anybody else in. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. Now these were professional mourners. It seems strange to us today that you'd need somebody to encourage you to wail and cry at someone's death, but they were professional mourners. And he went in and said to them, this is Jesus talking, why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. Notice what they did when he said that, but they laughed at him. And some, I don't know if it's King James or not, some translations say they laughed him to scorn. Now, Jesus often used the word sleep for death. You'll remember he used it for Lazarus as well. Because the disciples said, well, then he's doing good if he's asleep. Jesus says, no, Lazarus is dead. And then the Apostle Paul, when the Thessalonian people were worried about their loved ones, this is in the first years of the church, they were all worried about their loved ones that died. Because they knew that Jesus was going to come back any minute. Their loved ones were dead. What was going to happen to them? And then Paul assured them that, when Jesus comes back, they're going to go first. So don't worry about them. He said because they're asleep in Jesus. The first martyr in the church, Stephen, after he was stoned to death, the Bible said he fell asleep. So that was a favorite word of a lot of the Bible people. And it shows what death is like. Our body sleeps in the grave. But we know from the scriptures that our souls go back to God who gave it. And then at the coming of Jesus Christ, when he comes back, the soul will be united with the body, and then the body will be miraculously changed into a body fit to live in heaven. It can't be a physical body because we already learned that flesh and blood cannot enter heaven. But he will make us new bodies that will go into heaven. So now we read, after he put them all out, those that laughed at him, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha koum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately, the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this. Now, notice the very practical thing that he did in the very last line, and told them to give her something to eat. You know, when it comes to good health and even sickness, we have to have some common sense too, don't we? She needed nourishment. You know, there are some folks who think it's wrong or even sinful to call a doctor or take somebody to the hospital because Jesus should be able to do the healing if he wanted to do it. However, we know that Jesus condoned medicine. We know that one of the men who wrote the Bible, Luke, was a medical doctor. So there's no put down of medicine. And even eating right and getting rest, all of these things. Jesus, you remember, after they heard about the death of John the Baptist, Jesus took them off by himself because he knew that they had to grieve. And he planned places for them to rest. So Jesus was concerned about our physical as well as our spiritual well-being. So this is a wonderful story about Jesus and death. And of course we know that he himself died on the cross and then resurrected, and that's the hope that you and I have for ourselves and for our loved ones when they leave this world. That they too have gone to sleep, and that's just their bodies, but their spirits went back to be with God. So we're thankful and grateful for these beautiful words in Mark. These are highlights, I think, of the first 5 chapters in my understanding. And I would like to finish Mark out. I'm going to use 5 more chapters and then 6 more chapters after that. And then I'll be getting us, like Wednesday night, we'll be going back to the Old Testament. And we just have to do that in order to keep up with people's readings. We have to go back because of the long books in the Old Testament. But we will do that. And I don't think it's going to be hard for us to make the transition going back because I try to do a complete story in each section as we go and not leave you dangling in the air. So then we'll go ahead and have our closing hymn at this time. And if you'll stand, we'll sing the first and last verses of 629.